morning and welcome to Faith Family United Church of Christ Sunday morning Bible study. We're in the middle of a series. We're calling it Bible 101, and we're in week 15, in which we will be going over Isaiah. Our Bible study, in a sense, is going over each book of the Bible and kind of hitting the highlights of each Bible and explaining what's in them and how we can kind of adapt that to our world today. Let's go ahead and get started. You can see here's our overview. We've already been through the book of the Law, the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. We've gone through the historical books and the prophetic books, or the wisdom literature. And we're starting in the book of prophetic books, starting with the book of Isaiah. Now, a lot of people will break down the prophetic books into the first 5 or 6, and those are the major prophets, and then the other 12 are the minor prophets. And the only reason why they're called major prophets and minor prophets is not by importance, but rather by the length. And so the prophets go by length. Isaiah is the first prophet, and his length is very long. There are 66 chapters in the book of Isaiah. But before we get into Isaiah, I want to do some background on the prophets themselves. There's this misconception about prophets, and that is that prophets are somehow, they tell the future. When we say prophecy, we seem to point to them saying something that will happen in the future. And there's a verse in the New Testament that says, you can judge a prophet by if what they say comes true. But that isn't necessarily how a prophet functions. A prophet functions more like a social justice advocate. If you go through and you look at all the prophets, they're basically talking to the leadership of the society and society as a whole, and saying, change your ways or God's going to punish us. And by saying God's going to punish us, more or less what they're saying is, if we continue down this path, something drastic is going to happen. So I would much rather we look at prophets as people that are talking about what's going on in our society and how we make it a better society, rather than, they're trying to prophesy about the future. So that's a big thing. Now, I have a book that I wish everybody could read, and it's by one of my old professors, Dr. Jason Bembry, and he points out that there are prophets today. They're just not considered scripture, but in his book he points out that everyone could be a prophet. That is, everyone can point to the social woes that we have and call them out. Speak for the marginalized, speak for the oppressed, and by doing so, then you're becoming a prophet. Another class that I took with Dr. Bembry was one in which we looked at some of the people in the media today, poets, songwriters, and people that were doing just this. They were calling out the people that were oppressing people. They were calling out those that were marginalizing people. And you can see that in songs. One of my favorite was, of course, Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan, he speaks, he is a modern day prophet, although I saw an interview the other day, he says he's not. But still, they're speaking to what's wrong with our society and how we can change it. And what happens if we don't change it, kind of like Orwell in his 1984 pointed out, if we continued going the way we were by the year 1984, we would look like a dictatorial or a communist at the time understanding of a government. So that's the idea behind prophets. Okay, why do we think that prophets tell the future? Well, it's tradition. It's mostly tradition, and I had a note in one of my NIV Bibles, and it says, talking about Isaiah, it says, this message to the exiles, talking about the later part of Isaiah, in the 6th century BCE, Isaiah was projected into the future just as the Apostle John in Revelation. Now see, there's where I differ from their understanding. I don't understand Revelation as John being projected into the future, even though it says that, but he had a vision. He had a vision, and his vision correlates to what's going on around him at the time. And so by understanding what's going on around him at the time, this is what's going to happen in the future if we continue and we don't change some things. And so I think the same is for Isaiah. And we'll get into that in a little bit, because Isaiah's lifespan, his prophecies extend for over 200 years, and there's no way one person could have written all that. So we'll get into that when we get into Isaiah. But the idea of a prophet telling the future is because they're talking about the situation that's around them, and if things don't change, this is what the future will look like. And if that doesn't come, then you go, okay, then we must have changed for the positive. So, prophets speak for God in respect to the oppressed and the marginalized. That is a big theme throughout the prophets, is the oppressed, the marginalized, taking care of widows and orphans, taking care of the strangers in your land. All of this is in the prophets. And they're saying that you have to do these things to be a fully functioning society. Okay? So they usually prophesied to corrupt or ungodly rulers and their governments and society as a whole. Okay, so the main question when we look at the prophets, and this is what will determine whether you believe they're talking about the future, or they're seeing into the future, or they're talking about the times around us, is the question, when did they write about the future, or were they writing about what is happening in their society? Are they skilled interpreters of their times? In other words, do they have some kind of godly or insight about what's going on around them that helps them to make these prophecies and say, hey, if this doesn't change, then this is going to happen? Or do they see the future with God's miracles? And I think the thing about this is when we talk about this, is when did they write this stuff? Did they write this stuff before it happened, or did they write this stuff after it happened? And we can see that in the world today, where people say, I told you, when they didn't really make it public or what have you, and they pointed to something that happened in the past and you knew it was going to come to this. So is that when they're writing that, hey, because of this has happened? We see that a lot in people, in fundamentalist people who want to say that God is punishing us for X and Y. They're not being prophets, they're just trying to say that God is punishing us for doing this. Where, is that what these prophets were doing, or were they simply saying, hey, we're doing this, and if we don't change it in the future? I go with that one. I go with that one, that they see what's going on around them, and they say, if we don't change, then our future is going to be kind of dim. Okay, so let's go to Isaiah. Isaiah is our first prophet that we're going to look at. The traditionalist attitude towards Isaiah is that it was written by one person, that is the son of Amoz, and in it throughout we hear about the Holy One of Israel. And this is only, it's only used 6 other times as Holy One is Israel, and most of the times it's right here in Isaiah. And so they try to point to the person Isaiah, the very person, and suggest that he wrote all of the books of Isaiah, chapter 1 through 9 in his younger years, chapter 40 through 66 in his latter years, with the message to the exiles in Babylon as a vision that he was projected into the future, as we said in the little quote that I did. So that's the traditionalist view. Today's scholars attribute the writings to several people over a long span of time. They divide the book up into 3 time periods or parts. They call them 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Isaiah. 1st Isaiah is 1 through 39, and the time frame is from about 735 to 732 BCE. Then 2nd Isaiah was 40 through 55, and that is from 597 to 539 BCE. That's the time of the exile. And then 3rd Isaiah is 56 through 66, and the time frame for that is 520 to 515 BCE. Now, if you add that all up, the lifespan of Isaiah, the one person, would be over 220 years old. There's nothing said supernatural about Isaiah, saying that he lived an extra long time than everybody else. So scholars today attribute it to several different people, which was common in that time to have like a school of prophets, people that went to school and they learned things and they wrote under one person's name. So maybe they suggest that maybe Isaiah started the prophecy and he had a school and he had some apprentices, kind of like we talked about Elijah and Elisha. But they just kept the name Isaiah, kind of like artists used to do. They used to have hundreds of people working for them, and they would teach them their techniques. And then whatever those people did, of course, the artist would direct what they were painting and everything, and then it would be attributed to the artist and not his pupils. So 220-year lifespan, little much, so break up Isaiah into the 3 parts and just say that it was the prophet's Isaiah. Okay, historical framework and biblical references. In 1st Isaiah, chapter 1 through 35, like we said, it was 735 to 732. And this was from King Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiel. These are the kings of Judah. If you recall back in when we went over kings, these were kings of Judah. And the book of Isaiah begins with his first prophecy or his first vision in the year of King Uzziah's death. So that was in 735. In this time there were 3 divisions. There was the war with the Syro Ephraimite. I can say that. It's not. It's funny when you have to say words that are from a different language, and your lips just don't. The English lips just don't want to go that way. But the Syro Ephraimite, that was one of the tribes of Judah, and that's when Syria attacked them, and there was a war at that time. So at the beginning of the prophecies, we see that this kind of stuff is incorporated into Isaiah's prophecies. The second time period was during Sargon II, and this was when there was a lot of anti-Assyrian protests going on. Assyria was a big major powerhouse in governments, and they came and were basically starting to take over. And so the patriots of Israel were rising up and protesting, and there were a lot of anti-Assyrian stuff going on because they were Israelites and they could take on anybody. So yeah, you can see my little sarcasm there. So that was 720 to 710, and then finally Hezekiah's revolt against Sennacherib, and basically that ended with the Babylonian captivity. So that's the first part of Isaiah 1 through 39. In Isaiah 2, which is 40 through 45, this is all in the context of the Babylonian exile. So the audience is those Israelites living in Babylon, which is interesting because that would mean that Isaiah went from being the prophet in Israel, and then he's now a prophet in Babylon, in exile with the Israelites in Babylon. So this whole time frame, 40 through 55, those 15 chapters revolve around what's going on in Babylon. And then we have Isaiah 56 through 66, and this is 520 through 515, and this is after the captivity, the whole time in captivity, when King Cyrus sends them back to Jerusalem, and they're starting to rebuild the temple and rebuild the wall, and that is when these prophecies are being taken place. So those are the three Isaiahs and their time frames, and kind of give you an idea in the Bible where they are. This last one would be where Ezra and Nehemiah. We see Ezra and Nehemiah rebuilding the temple and rebuilding the wall. Okay, so the message of First Isaiah. First Isaiah starts out with a rebuke and promises. In other words, they're doing things wrong. He rebukes them. The God told him to say this to them, and if you do that, these are my promises. From there, we get threat from invasion. In other words, he's talking about the Syrians, not the Syrians. Yes, the Syrians coming down and attacking. That was the tribe of Ephraim, and so that's the Syro-Ephraimite war, and what this is going to cause. And then God's judgment against all the nations. In other words, these nations were going to feel God's wrath because they are taking over his God's chosen people. But he's using them as a tool for this, as his punishment. And then we have the 5 woes. Woe to you, Israel, because of this. Woe to you. And it sounds a lot like, you can see where Jesus, of course, most of the stuff that Jesus talked about comes straight from the Old Testament, because this is what the Jews of his time, the Israelites, would understand. So when he says his woes, Jesus says his woes, he knows in their minds they are going back and they are referencing Isaiah and the 5 woes from Isaiah in the first part of the book of Isaiah. So then more results of your actions and your promises. In other words, God says, if you do this, well, I'm going to do this, but if you do this, then you will prosper. So there's promises and there's results of the action. And then the final part of First Isaiah, of course, is the siege of Jerusalem and Isaiah's prediction of the exile. Got a question? Okay. So, second Isaiah, once again, this is the exile period. They're in exile, 597 to 539. And while they're in exile, prophecies are of deliverance and restoration of Israel. he also talks about how they need to do certain things, and they need to remember God. They need to stay and be faithful to one God. And then in Isaiah, 3rd Isaiah, in chapter 56 through 66, that roughly between 5:20 and 5:15, this is what they call the everlasting God prophecies. In other words, God is everlasting. God's salvation will be everlasting, and for the people. And there's some language in there. Is God's salvation just for the Jews, or is God's salvation for everyone? And then it also talks about God's judgment and it being everlasting. And now today, as Christians, if we put that into our context, then we say that God's salvation is everlasting for all people, and that God's judgment, which came upon who? But Jesus, and that is everlasting. So when Christ died upon the cross, that was God's punishment for all of sin, and therefore, since sin was abolished there, then there is no sin if you are in Christ, so to speak. So if we abide in the ways of Christ, then truly God's judgment is everlasting. So, any questions yet? Okay, so the book of Isaiah, I wish I had the book from Dr. Bembry. Maybe next time I'll pull it out of my library and show it to you, since we will be talking about the prophets, and I'll show you that book and we'll look into that a little bit more. But I don't have any questions online, and I don't have any questions here between the dogs and Cindy, so we'll go ahead and wrap it up. So thanks, and have a great weekend.